Some of you are lonely. Sometimes I will be speaking or preaching somewhere and somebody will come up and say, I'm really lonely and I don't know what to do. But what I notice is that sometimes they look around and make sure nobody's listening to them. And I know that sometimes some of the loneliest people I know are people that you would never assume they're lonely. If you went around them, they would seem to be really involved with everyone around them. You look at their Instagram feed or their Facebook page or whatever, and they certainly seem to be very, very connected and seem to be involved in a lot of things and invited to a lot of stuff. But if you really know them, they're often really lonely. And studies show us that loneliness is something that is at an almost epidemic rate around us, and has all sorts of different causes. So people will come up with different ways of saying why this is taking place. But we do know a lot of people around us are really lonely, and a lot of Christian people are really lonely. And people tend to respond to loneliness in different ways. So sometimes people respond with a kind of frenetic activity. So that person that you may think of that you think, well, she doesn't seem lonely to me because I'm looking at her social media feed and she seems to be in a crowd of people and always involved with stuff. Well, sometimes that is actually a response to loneliness. She's trying to work through her loneliness. Or you're saying, it doesn't seem to me that he's lonely because he's always working or he's always serving or he's always doing something else. Well, it may be that this is the way that person responds to loneliness, is with that kind of whirlwind of activity, whether social or vocational or ministry or whatever. Sometimes people respond with a sort of numbing of themselves or maybe even a kind of addiction, and I mean that both in the formal sense and also in the kind of casual sense that we use it. So I'm not necessarily talking about drugs or alcohol or substances, although it can be that. Sometimes people respond to loneliness just by trying to get their mind off of it with a lot of maybe binge watching of television or movies or video games or golf or whatever. Any number of things that are perfectly fine, but they're trying to fill the void of connection in a way that doesn't really work. Sometimes people do it with social media. So they try to make a lot of connections via social media, and sometimes genuine connections can happen via social media. I mean, there's some of you that I know that are genuine relationships and genuine friendships that started because we got to know each other digitally and electronically. That happens, but it's always because it sort of continues into a different sort of connection. And then there are a lot of people who just sort of try to find a mob to absorb themselves into. That's why you have the sort of tribalism that we see, whether in social media sorts of mobs or political sorts of tribes or whatever. They're trying to address loneliness. So what I'd like to talk about today is, why is this a problem? Why is loneliness a problem? Well, a Christian vision of reality explains that. I mean, from the very beginning, God says it is not it's not good for the man, the human being, to be alone. Now, we often hear that talked about in the context of maybe a marriage ceremony, because out of that comes the creation of Eve. And marriage certainly has a lot to do with it, but it's not just about marriage, because what's happening with the formation of Eve is they will cleave together and become one flesh and be fruitful and multiply. So what God is talking about is the beginning of humanity, of multiple people rather than just one person. And so if you look at the pattern of humanity that we see, the way that we see that in its goal form is in the life of Jesus Christ. This is somebody who is not married. He doesn't have a biological family. He has an extended family, but he doesn't have children. But he's part of a community. He's part of a body. He's the head over a body there. But you also notice, just in terms of the life of Jesus, that you have this pattern of withdrawal and community. So Jesus is, on the one hand, someone who is sort of a lonely figure. He's walking alone, and yet he also is somebody who is embedded within a community and embedded within a family. And that is the sort of pattern that the Scripture gives to us then going forward. We are meant to have a personal relationship with God. We're not part of a herd. We're not part of a collective that comes before God. We come before God one by one through new birth. But we're part of a body. We're part of a church with brothers and sisters together. So you think, for instance, of the way that Paul talks about spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians. Those spiritual gifts are individual, so my gift is going to differ from yours, and yet they're part of the connection with the rest of the body. So the spiritual gifts are meant to serve. So that's not just an external connection. There are people who are around a lot of people who nonetheless are lonely. Sometimes I find that I'm the loneliest when I am around a lot of people because I have responsibilities toward people, but that can sometimes be isolating, and that sometimes can actually make you lonelier. And so for me, anyway, I have a group of friends gather together every once in a while at one of our homes. It is really an informal sort of gathering. Usually what happens is one of us, the one whose house it is, will sort of text a group of people and say, hey, let's get together tonight. There's not an agenda. It's not a game night. It's not what we just get together and we're just with each other. And I have found the Lord has used that in my life tremendously when it comes to loneliness and isolation. And there are all sorts of ways that God can do that. And what your question might be is, well, how do you get that? Well, I think the first thing is to realize sometimes we don't want to say that we're lonely when we are, because there's all sorts of things that we might have going on that if we tell people, that's okay. So for instance, it's really, really easy to tell people I'm overworked or I'm busy, because that makes you seem like a successful sort of person in modern Western life. But if you tell people you're lonely, you're afraid that means I'm a loser. But it doesn't. I mean, that's part of what, with loneliness being so epidemic, it certainly does not mean that you are a loser. It means you're a human being living at this time. And so how do you then make connections with people? Well, I think one of those ways is simply to tell people, hey, I'm really experiencing loneliness right now. That doesn't mean that you necessarily walk up to somebody and say, hey, will you be my best friend? But it means to come up and say, I really need some connection and I'm lonely. And I think what you'll find is there are a lot of people who are similarly lonely who aren't saying it because they're fearful of rejection. And so simply to say to people, hey, I'm lonely, I really need some connection in my life, and I'm not even sure what that looks like yet. The other thing I would say is find a place to serve. And so minister to lonely people, maybe people who are in a much worse situation than you're in, elderly people who may be shut in or in nursing homes, homeless people who may not have any connection to anyone. Find a place that sort of fits with your gifts, pour yourself into that, and while you're there, find the others who are there similarly serving. And as you do that, pray and ask God. Name the loneliness that you experience and say, God, I'm lonely. I need some connection. And sometimes what you'll find is that God has brought you through a time of inordinate solitude, through a time of loneliness, in order to cultivate certain gifts, certain attitudes, a certain sense of empathy toward other people, often who are really lonely. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. Do you agree? Do you disagree with what we talked about today? Let me know in the comments below. Also, let me know what you'd like for us to talk about in the future on this channel. And don't forget to like or share this video if you found it helpful, and make sure that you subscribe and hit notifications so that you can get all of our new videos when they release.